Hi, so we're going to continue now with part 3 of the 50th Law written by 50 Cent and Robert Greene. Introduction. The Fearless Type. The very first thing I remember in my early childhood is a flame, a blue flame, jumping off a gas stove somebody lit. I was 3 years old. I felt fear, real fear, for the first time in my life, but I remember it also like some kind of adventure, some kind of weird joy, too. I guess that experience took me someplace in my head I hadn't been before, to some frontier, the edge, maybe of everything possible. The fear I had was almost like an invitation, a challenge to go forward into something I knew nothing about. That's where I think my personal philosophy of life started, with that moment. In my mind, I've always believed and thought since then that my motion had to be forward, away from the heat of that flame. Miles Davis. There are two ways of dealing with fear, one passive, the other active. In the passive mode, we seek to avoid the situation that causes us anxiety. This can translate into postponing any decisions in which we might hurt other people's feelings. It could mean opting for everything to be safe and comfortable in our daily lives, so no amount of messiness can enter. When we are in this mode, it is because we feel we are fragile and would be damaged by an encounter with the thing we dread. The active variety is something most of us have experienced at some point in our lives. The risky and difficult situation that we fear is thrust upon us. It could be a natural disaster, a death of someone close to us, or a reversal in fortune in which we lose something. Often in these moments we find an inner strength that surprises us. What we feared is not so bad. We cannot avoid it, and we have to find a way to overcome our fear or suffer real consequences. Such moments are oddly therapeutic because finally we are confronting something real, not an imagined fear scenario fed to us by the media. We can let go of this fear. The problem is that such moments tend to not last very long or repeat themselves too often. They can quickly lose their value, and we return to the passive avoidance mode. When we live in relatively comfortable circumstances, the environment does not press on us with obvious dangers, violence, or limitations to our movement. Our main goal then is to maintain the comfort and security we have, and so we become more sensitive to the slightest risk or threat to the status quo. We find it harder to tolerate feelings of fear because they are more vague and troubling, so we remain in passive mode. Throughout history, however, there are people who have lived in much tighter circumstances, dangers pressing in on them on a daily basis. These types must confront their fears in the active mode again and again. This could be growing up in extreme poverty, facing death on the battlefield, or leading an army in war, living through tumultuous revolutionary periods, being a leader in a time of crisis, suffering personal loss or tragedy, or having a brush with death. Countless people grow up in with such circumstances, and their spirit is crushed by adversity. But a few rise above. It is their only positive choice. They must confront these daily fears and overcome them, or submit to the downward pull. They are toughened and hardened to the point of steel. Understand, no one is born this way. It is unnatural not to feel fear. It is a process that requires challenges and tests. What separates those who go under and those who rise above adversity is the strength of their will and their hunger for power. At some point, this defensive position of overcoming fears converts to an offensive one, a fearless attitude. Such types learn the value not only of being unafraid, but also of attacking life with a sense of boldness and urgency and an unconventional approach, creating new models instead of following old ones. They see the great power this brings them, and it soon becomes their dominant mindset. We find these types in all cultures and time periods, from Socrates and the Stoics to Cornelius Vanderbilt and Abraham Lincoln. Napoleon Bonaparte represents a classic, fearless type. He began his career in the military just as the French Revolution exploded. At the critical moment in his life, he had experienced one of the most chaotic and terrifying periods in history. He faced endless challenges on the battlefield as a new kind of warfare was emerging, and he navigated through innumerable political intrigues in which one wrong move could lead to the guillotine. He emerged from all this with a fearless spirit, embracing the chaos of the times and the vast changes going on in the art of war. In one of his innumerable campaigns, he expressed the words that could serve as the motto for all fearless types. In the spring of 1800, he was preparing to lead an army into Italy. His field marshals warned him that the Alps were not passable at this time of year and told him to wait, even though waiting would spoil chances for success. The general replied to them, "For Napoleon's army there shall be no Alps." And mounted on a mule, Napoleon proceeded to personally lead his troops through treacherous terrain and past innumerable obstacles. It was the force of one man's will that brought them through the Alps, catching the enemy completely by surprise and defeating them. There are no Alps and no obstacles that can stand in the way of a person without fears. Another example of this type would have to be the great abolitionist and writer Frederick Douglass, who was born into slavery in Maryland in 1817. As he later wrote, slavery was a system that depended upon the creation of deep levels of fear. Douglass continually forced himself in the opposite direction. Despite the threat of severe punishment, he secretly taught himself to read and write. When he was whipped for his rebellious attitude, he fought back and saw that he was whipped less often. Without money or connections, he escaped to the North at the age of 20. He became a leading abolitionist, touring the North and telling audiences about the evils of slavery. Abolitionists wanted him to stay on his lecture circuits and repeat the same stories over and over. But Douglass wanted to do much more, and once again he rebelled. He founded his own anti-slavery newspaper, an unheard of act for a former slave. The newspaper went on to have tremendous success. At each stage of his life, Douglass was tested by the powerful odds against him. Instead of giving in to the fear of whippings, being alone on the streets of unfamiliar cities, facing the wrath of the abolitionists, he raised his level of boldness and pushed himself further into the offensive. This confidence gave him the power to rise above the fierce resistances, and animosities of those around him. That is the physics of the fearless types that all fearless types discover at some point, an appropriate ratcheting up of self-belief and energy when facing negative or even impossible circumstances. Fearless people do not emerge exclusively from poverty or harsh physical circumstance. Franklin Delano Roosevelt grew up in a wealthy, privileged family. At the age of 39, he contracted polio, which paralyzed him from the waist down. This was a turning point in his life, as he faced severe limitation to his movement and possibly to an end to his political career. He refused, however, to give in to the fear and the downward pull on his spirit. He went in the opposite direction, struggling to make the most of his physical condition and developing an indomitable spirit that would transform him into the most fearless president. For this type of person, any kind of encounter with adversity or limitation at any age can serve as the crucible of forging the attitude.